I'm pleased to speak on the Office for Early Childhood Education Bill and indicate that I should say the Office for Early Childhood Development Bill and indicate that I am the lead speaker for the opposition. A range of matters I'll bring to the House's attention, and if the requirement is that I have to break from transmission at 5:31 if the House would arise, I'll seek leave and continue tomorrow. I'll foreshadow that I don't anticipate it being a hugely lengthy contribution, but as we are just 15 minutes from the end of today's session potentially, I'll endeavour this afternoon to put some matters on the record which will be complemented separately by matters that I'll bring to the attention tomorrow.
You have unlimited time, and when you seek leave, it's your business and no one else's.
Thank you, sir. So, we're dealing with the Office for Early Childhood Development Bill. This bill seeks to establish in legislation an office, a department, if you will, and there is a question then about whether or not the functions and goals of this department are best set into effect through legislation, or whether it would be capable of being achieved through the normal procedure, which is, as is already the case, given that this office already exists, through the Public Sector Act. The fact that the Premier is able to create a department, to create an agency, to create an office without requiring its own bill. So we'll go into that. There's secondly then the merits of the bill. Which is established to create the Office for Early Childhood Development, which is going to be a system steward, as is described, for the early childhood development sector, which does not just comprise government services, but also non-government services, whether they be out-of-school hours care, whether they be long day care services, childcare, as it's more commonly referred to, and indeed a whole wide range of other providers and stakeholders. The legislation is created not just in terms of providing policy leadership in this space, but also to have the powers to compel the provision of information from other government departments and agencies, and also from non-government providers. It is particularly in relation to this last point that I will spend a little bit of time this afternoon, and hopefully I'll have some further time to expand on the other topics tomorrow. Because this office already exists, and I start by expressing my gratitude to the Minister's Office and to the public servants involved, so to Jamie and Joanna from the Department for Education, who are very well known to this chamber, and we may get to meet them again in the committee stage of this debate for their extensive work in supporting various items of education legislation through the Parliament over the years. To Kim Little, the new Chief Executive, or new-ish Chief Executive of the Office for Early Childhood Development, and to Amy Ralphs, I should say, the Minister's Advisor. When it became apparent that this bill would be brought on this week, at relatively short notice, we'd anticipated originally a little bit more time to do some more consultation. That group of people came together at short notice and to be able to brief me. And indeed, we had a good half-hour session talking about it. There were other matters that came up that meant that we couldn't get through everything. But one of the key things that came out of that meeting was indeed my first question. Given that this office already exists, given that it exists, we've got a chief executive, we've got staff doing the work, why does it need an Act of Parliament? Even the Department for Education isn't created by the Education Children's Services Act, it is created as a function of the Public Sector Act. The SA Health Act talks about a range of things, but the Department for Health is created through the Public Sector Act. Most departments that report to the ministers that sit on the front bench are created by the Public Sector Act, not by their own Acts of Parliament. Acts of Parliament tend to be reserved for commissions, for advocacy and oversight bodies, for groups like the Ombudsman, people who have certain powers or duties that are separate from government. A lot of our arts institutions are created by Acts of Parliament so that they have independence to a certain extent, or that they have a particular role in the public sphere which is independent of the government of the day. the universities are established by their own acts of parliament and have their own functions set out in that way. So why does this department, with the chief executive appointed by and responsible to the Premier, as are all the other chief executives, with a day-to-day functioning reporting to a minister in a fairly standard public service mechanism, why does this department need its own Act of Parliament rather than just operating as it already does under the Public Sector Act? The answer from the briefing, if I can fairly try and summarise it, comes down to two things, but really one thing. It's about the powers. And to a second extent about the lasting nature of something that is legislated as opposed to being responsive to the preferences of the government of the day. But even that, it comes down to powers, because the powers to compel the provision of information that are in this Act are a result of the functions of the Act. So the powers, which are detailed for those following on at home, are in clause number 10, 11 and 12, particularly in relation to number 11 of the bill. Clause 10 of the bill provides the Chief Executive to require other state authorities to provide reports, basically into any matter that is set out as reasonable according to the functions of the office. Now, the fact is that that can already happen, but this bill sets out a mechanism that says that if the state authority, so for example, if this Office for Early Childhood Development is seeking to compel the Minister for Tourism's department to provide information to it, at the moment it can ask. This bill will empower the Chief Executive of the Office for Early Childhood Education can compel the Minister for Tourism's public servants to provide them with whatever information they ask for, so long as it is consistent with the functions under the Act. But if the Minister for Tourism's officers decide not to, the methodology then is that the OECD department provides a report to their minister of the refusal or failure of that department to do so. That gets reported in the annual report, and the minister can try and resolve it. The Minister for Education goes to the Minister for Tourism and says, "Can you please get your public servants to do this?" And that's the mechanism described. There's no punishment or consequence for failure to do so, but at the end of the day, that is what is set out in clause 10 of the bill. The minister then may decide to, by notice in writing, exempt a state authority from the operation of this section. So ultimately, the Education Minister, when the Minister for Tourism explains why her public servants didn't necessarily want to provide information, the Minister for Education can say, "OK, that's fine." But it's potentially, and this is why the opposition is keen ultimately, before we decide on whether or not we're going to offer any amendments or opposition to the bill, there's an impact on non-government agencies which is more profound than that which might be suffered by the Minister for Tourism and her officers in such a situation. Because clause 11 says the Chief Executive may, by notice in writing, require a specified entity, whether or not it's a state authority, an officer of a state authority, to provide the Chief Executive such information or documents as may be specified in the notice, being information or documents in the possession of the entity that the Chief Executive reasonably requires for the performance of functions under this Act. I'll go through the functions later, but to be clear, they go up to N, so there's a fair number of those functions. And if the Chief Executive, in fulfilling any of those functions, identifies that there is information that one of these non-government agencies might be required to produce, then they are empowered to demand that, with a penalty of $5,000 for the entity that fails to comply with such a notice or refuses to comply with such a notice. An entity, 11.3 of the bill, it's described that an entity of whom a requirement is made under subsection 1 must give the specified information or documents to the Chief Executive within the period specified in the notice. Now, this may be fine. This is a heavily regulated part of public policy. It's also a very heavily publicly funded part of public policy, particularly through Commonwealth subsidies to parents who then pay childcare centres, in effect. We are talking about a large number of bodies, though. So, for example, in the development of this policy, it's an understanding that there is not so much an early childhood system as an early childhood sector. That is, that there are government early childhood providers, particularly preschools. There's about 400 government preschools in South Australia, not quite 400, but there's nearly 400. There's about 47 early childhood centres, and some of those are preschools, some of them are long daycare centres, some of them are allied health providers, some of them are playgroups. Most of them will have multiple functions within that setting. So the government is a major service provider. And then there is a significant community sector in this area. There are about 100 community childcare centres in South Australia who are also captured by this legislation, mostly offering long daycare services, some of them offering other services as well. Then there are a large number of children who get long daycare in private childcare settings, whether they are mum and dad operations with potentially 1 or 2 or 3 centres, or whether they are large national companies, potentially even international companies, with dozens and dozens and dozens of centres, whether they're South Australian based or auspiced interstate or overseas. And then in addition to that, there are non-government schools, of which there are 200 in South Australia, many of which offer early childhood settings as well. There are providers of out-of-school hours care in government settings and non-government settings, some of which are indeed related to those schools and some of which are companies established for the purposes of providing out-of-school hours care. And then there are councils which run long daycare centres, and then there are family daycare providers as well, who, although they are all coordinated through the Department for Education, are not employees of the Department for Education. They are, in effect, I mean, they're family daycare settings. They are the ultimate mum and dad small business. They are people working from home, performing work under contract through the Department for Education who regulate them. There's also a range of other providers and stakeholders who are relevant to the bill. People offering playgroup services, for example, can be anything from a private business to a community group established for the purposes of providing a playgroup, to any other number of organisations. These are the people who are captured, and I say thousands of people and thousands of entities potentially, by this information gathering power. Don't want to act as if this is the end of the world. It's, in many cases, this is going to be a very logical and very sensible information gathering exercise in which we can better inform public policy so that the government of the day can help South Australia's children in their first 1,000 days of life in particular from being the best that they can be, ensure that government policy where it can be implemented in a way that is useful and helpful in helping children develop and be less developmentally vulnerable by the time they get to school, and all of the worthy things that are identified in the Royal Commission and in government members' speeches, many of these information gathering powers will potentially assist in the government to do that best. But every time government creates a new power for a public servant, in this case somebody who is appointed Chief Executive of the Office for Early Childhood Development, having a power, the failure to comply with that power by a private individual, having a $5,000 penalty, which is no insignificant amount for an individual, a family daycare provider operating from home, or for a small business operating a long daycare service, for example, or a community childcare centre with very, very minimal margins, which those margins designed to be reinvested in their service provision. Every time we create one of these powers, it deserves consideration and scrutiny. And the question I asked in the briefing was effectively, well, why do we need this power to be created in legislation? This is something that can already be sought by government. And inasmuch as the government is providing funding to many of these services to operate, and we're talking about, in the case of the model for 3-year-old preschool, or what the government's describing as 3-year-old preschool, the provision of new funding, then surely the provision back of information as being one of the requirements for getting that funding, that new funding, can be dealt with without creating this new offence, without creating this new power, this new penalty of $5,000 on a person. So, it's my simple proposition that I want to ask people in the sector whether they have a view. And those emails, those letters are going out this week, and that will inform ultimately whether... I'm not proposing to seek a delay or argue for a delay in this House, it's not necessary, but I am proposing that between the Houses, the opposition may well identify amendments, particularly to this section, if it is necessary to respond to some of the feedback that I may get from the sector. I understand in relation to clause 12 of the bill, which relates to the sharing of information between certain entities, those entities being the Office, the Department, the Commissioner for Children and Young People, the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, the Guardian for Children and Young People, the Child Development Council, a State Authority, government and non-government schools, childcare services and OSH services, the Association of Independent Schools of South Australia, Catholic Education, the South Australian Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation Network, those entities all being in legislation, and then any other entities or entities of a class prescribed by legislation, but by regulations I should say. This clause sets out that information can be provided between those organisations for the purposes of fulfilling the Act. Now, there are penalties in relation to misuse of those information sharing provisions, those penalties being up to $10,000. I'm not anticipating these entities having any complaints about this clause. In fact, I've been reassured to some extent that some of these organisations listed specifically requested being included in legislation because that will enable them to more freely share information, particularly if there are concerns about privacy provisions. But we'll be checking up on that as well as we go through our consideration and our consultation on the matter. I think that there is a lot of goodwill in the sector towards what is being sought, not just by this government, but by successive governments when it comes to seeking to reduce vulnerability of young children before they go into school. It was a significant body of work undertaken under the former Marshall Liberal government through my department in the Department of Education at the time, indeed with specific support and assistance from the member for Colton and the Honourable Nicola Centafanti, who I brought in to effectively be part of a working group along with some departmental officers in terms of how we address some of these particular challenges about the vulnerabilities of children in their early childhood development. There are is a concern for young people in South Australia and for our community in South Australia that the data relating to the vulnerabilities of children entering preschool or school with at least one level of vulnerability on the early childhood development census has been growing in South Australia when in other states it has been diminishing. And this was a concern, and I should make the point that most of this data is from pre-2018. There's been one census conducted, I think it was 2021, in the midst of COVID, which was largely consistent with the 2018 results. But ultimately, that data informed recommendation 1 of the Gillard Royal Commission, which is to seek a reduction in early childhood vulnerability down to 15%. I think it's just north of 22% at the moment. The work that was done in 2020, 2021 in developing the 2021 early childhood budget bid, which was particularly focused in terms of the investment on increased levels of early childhood development checks, an increased spread of those early childhood development checks. It was $16 million a year ongoing in that investment. That was directly towards addressing this challenge, this opportunity for us to get better outcomes for those young people. That early childhood budget announcement also included investments in things that support parents in the work they do. The early childhood app that I imagine most parents now have, having been launched over a year ago was a key recommendation of that body of work funded in 2021 budget, as was indeed the foundation that Kate Ellis chaired in relation to bringing together stakeholders on what has become the Words Grow Minds campaign, which is also, I think, a boon to parents. Particular amount of work going into playgroups, grants for councils to make more child-friendly spaces. All of these bodies of works that are now forming part of the new government strategy, these were developed under the former Liberal government. When we come back to the bill, I'll talk more about the work that the government is seeking to do in three-year-old preschool in particular. But I make the point, a large volume of what this bill seeks to achieve is happening without the bill. This bill that people have been talking about this afternoon and which we are debating is specifically about creating a legislated office rather than having an office just doing the work without legislation. The difference between us passing this bill or not passing this bill, as far as I can tell, comes strictly down to whether or not the person appointed by the Premier as Chief Executive should have these powers, and secondly, whether the Parliament believes that there is a long-term policy implication associated with each of these functions, the set out in legislation, that would require the Parliament to change those functions in the future rather than a government presented with new information setting its own agenda in the future instead. We'll talk more about that next time, but for the moment, sir, I seek leave to continue my remarks.
What is leave granted? Minister, the